Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we stand at the edge of destiny where silence breaks and heaven responds. Midnight is not just a time on the clock, it is a spiritual junction where decrees are enforced and patterns are shattered. In this hour, favor is provoked by alignment and acceleration is released by obedience. When men sleep, covenant people arise to engage mysteries, to contend for speed, to call forth open doors, divine helpers, and irreversible lifting. This moment demands intensity, focus, and faith. Because what answers now changes seasons and rewrites stories. Midnight is a strategic spiritual time because it represents transitions, thresholds, and moments when the activities of the spirit realm are heightened beyond the ordinary. Throughout Scripture, midnight is repeatedly associated with divine intervention, judgment against oppression, and sudden reversals that defy natural explanation. It is not merely a late hour. It is a spiritual watch where destinies are confronted and patterns are confronted with authority. At midnight, human strength is at its lowest, distractions are minimized, and the heart is more sensitive to divine signals, making it a potent time for enforcing spiritual verdicts. This is why those who understand spiritual laws do not treat midnight casually, because certain battles will not respond to casual prayers offered in convenience, but to deliberate engagement at appointed times. In the realm of the spirit, timing is everything, and midnight carries a legal advantage. It is the point where one day hands over to another, symbolizing the end of an old cycle and the birth of a new one. Spiritual limitations often hide within cycles, repeating patterns that frustrate progress, delay manifestation, and resist change. Midnight prayers confront these cycles directly, declaring that what held yesterday has no authority over tomorrow. When a believer rises at midnight to pray, it is a prophetic action that announces refusal to be governed by negative patterns, ancestral limitations, or demonic schedules. It is a declaration that destiny will not be postponed because of unseen resistance. Midnight is also significant because it is a time when spiritual traffic is intense. Decisions are enforced, movements are coordinated, and assignments are released. Just as armies move strategically under the cover of darkness, spiritual forces also operate with precision at night. Ignoring this reality leaves many believers disadvantaged, not because God is absent during the day, but because certain gates respond more easily at night. When Paul and Silas prayed and sang hymns at midnight, it was not accidental. Their chains did not break because of volume, but because of alignment with a moment that carried enforcement power. The prison responded, the foundation shook, and systems that were designed to restrain them collapsed. Limitations thrive in ignorance and passivity, but midnight prayers introduce confrontation. Limitations can be spiritual, mental, financial, or generational, and they often persist because they are never challenged at their root. Midnight prayers are not emotional expressions. They are legal confrontations in the court of heaven. They present evidence, invoke covenant, and demand judgment against every force contending with destiny. At midnight, a believer is not begging for mercy alone, but standing on the authority of redemption to demand release, restoration, and acceleration. This is why results from midnight prayers are often sudden and dramatic, because they deal with causes, not symptoms. There is also a dimension of sacrifice associated with midnight prayers. To deny the body sleep in order to seek God is a powerful statement of priority. Sacrifice attracts attention in the spirit realm because it demonstrates value and seriousness. When God sees a believer willing to interrupt comfort for alignment, it provokes divine response. Many spiritual verdicts are not delayed because God is unwilling, but because there is no corresponding spiritual weight to enforce them. Midnight prayer carries weight because it costs something, and whatever costs you something carries authority when presented before God. Midnight prayers break limitations by engaging light in the midst of darkness. Darkness in Scripture represents ignorance, bondage, confusion, and oppression. When prayer rises at midnight, it is light invading darkness deliberately. This invasion exposes hidden obstacles, reveals unseen enemies, and dismantles structures that operate secretly. Many struggles persist because they operate in secrecy, beyond human awareness. Midnight prayer shines light into these regions, forcing resistance to lose its advantage. Once light is introduced, manipulation collapses and freedom becomes inevitable. Another reason midnight is strategic is because it trains spiritual discipline and consistency. Those who cultivate the habit of midnight prayer develop sensitivity, discernment, and authority over time. They learn to hear clearly, to pray accurately, and to command results because their spirits are trained to engage God beyond convenience. This discipline itself breaks limitations because many barriers are sustained by spiritual laziness and inconsistency. When a believer becomes disciplined in prayer, especially at demanding hours, their spiritual stature increases and certain battles no longer require prolonged struggle. Midnight prayer also aligns a believer with divine agendas rather than personal emotions. At that hour, prayers tend to be focused, intentional, and spiritually intelligent. There is less noise, fewer distractions, and more clarity. This allows the believer to pray according to divine will, invoking scriptures, promises, and prophetic instructions with precision. Prayers prayed in alignment with divine will carry authority, and authority enforces outcomes. This is how limitations are dismantled, not by force of desire, but by force of alignment. In many lives, delays and stagnation are not random. They are scheduled by opposing forces that exploit ignorance of spiritual timing. Midnight prayers disrupt these schedules. They announce that destiny will no longer be dictated by darkness but by light. When a believer prays at midnight, they are effectively declaring that every appointment of delay is cancelled, every embargo is lifted, and every closed gate is forced open by covenant authority. This is why midnight prayers often usher in rapid changes, unexpected opportunities, and supernatural breakthroughs. Ultimately, midnight prayers reposition a believer from victimhood to authority. Instead of reacting to life, the believer begins to legislate outcomes through prayer. Limitations lose their grip because they are confronted consistently, deliberately, and authoritatively. The spiritual realm responds to those who understand laws and timings, and midnight remains one of the most powerful times to enforce divine verdicts and break limitations that have resisted other forms of engagement, shifting the believer into a realm where resistance weakens and destiny begins to respond to divine order and spiritual alignment without negotiation. Favor is not a random occurrence. Neither is it a reward for mere effort or emotional sincerity. Favor responds to alignment with divine principles, and where alignment is absent, struggle becomes inevitable. Many people labor endlessly, applying strength, intelligence, and persistence, yet experience little progress because favor is governed by laws, not sympathy. In the economy of God, alignment positions a person within the flow of divine advantage, where outcomes are multiplied beyond human input. When alignment is present, doors open with ease, resistance diminishes, and helpers appear without manipulation. This is why two people can apply the same effort, yet produce radically different results, because favor does not follow effort alone, it follows positioning. Alignment begins with understanding divine order. God is a God of structure, sequence, and principles, and favor flows along these lines. When a life is out of order, favor is restricted, not as punishment, but as a consequence of misalignment. This order applies to spiritual priorities, values, relationships, and obedience. Many prayers fail not because God did not hear, but because the life praying is positioned outside the framework that allows favor to land. Favor cannot violate divine order, and so alignment becomes the first silent prayer that speaks louder than words. One of the most critical dimensions of alignment is obedience. Obedience is proof of submission to divine authority, and favor rests naturally on those who are submitted. Struggle increases where obedience is partial or selective. A person may obey in visible areas but resist in hidden ones, and this inconsistency creates friction in the spirit realm. Favor demands wholeness, not perfection, but sincerity of alignment. When obedience becomes complete, favor becomes predictable. This is why Scripture repeatedly connects obedience with blessings, not because God is transactional, but because obedience aligns the person with divine pathways. Alignment also involves spiritual understanding. Ignorance produces unnecessary struggle, even among sincere believers. When a person lacks understanding of how God operates, they may fight battles they were never meant to fight. Favor removes the need for unnecessary warfare by positioning a person correctly. Understanding seasons, instructions, and divine timing keeps a believer from forcing doors that are not assigned to them. When a person is aligned with divine timing, effort reduces and results increase, because grace supplies what strength cannot. Relationships are another powerful channel of alignment. God moves through people, and favor often arrives through divine connections. When relationships are dishonored, abused, or mishandled, favor leaks. Alignment requires recognizing who God has connected to your destiny and maintaining those relationships with honor, humility, and wisdom. Many people pray for favor while sabotaging the very vessels God intends to use. Favor flows where honor is practiced, and honor is a key indicator of alignment. Dishonor creates resistance in spiritual systems, slowing access and opportunity. Alignment with divine principles also includes integrity. Integrity sustains favor when it arrives. Without integrity, favor becomes dangerous because it elevates a person beyond their capacity to manage success. God withholds favor from certain areas not because of hatred, but because of mercy. Integrity aligns character with destiny, ensuring that when favor comes, it does not destroy the recipient. This is why some prayers for elevation seem unanswered, while God is actually working on internal alignment to protect the future. Another dimension of alignment is consistency. Favor responds to stable patterns, not occasional spirituality. A life that is aligned today and misaligned tomorrow sends mixed signals in the spirit realm. Consistency builds credibility before God and men. When consistency is present, favor is sustained, not episodic. Many people experience moments of favor but lack the alignment to maintain it. Consistent devotion, discipline, and values keep a person within the corridor where favor operates continuously. Alignment also requires humility. Pride displaces favor because it resists divine authority. Humility keeps a person teachable, correctable, and adjustable. God releases favor to those who can be redirected without resistance. A proud heart turns correction into offense, while a humble heart turns correction into elevation. Favor rests where humility creates room for divine involvement. When humility is absent, struggle increases because God resists the proud, not emotionally, but structurally, by denying them access to certain graces. Prayer itself is a tool of alignment, not persuasion. Prayer does not change God's mind, it aligns the believer with God's will. When prayer becomes alignment focused rather than demand driven, favor flows more freely. Prayers that seek understanding, correction, and direction produce more lasting results than prayers that only seek intervention. Alignment-oriented prayer positions the heart correctly, allowing favor to arrive without distortion. Favor also responds to alignment with purpose. When a person lives disconnected from why God created them, struggle becomes constant. Purpose alignment simplifies life because it channels energy toward divinely intended outcomes. Many frustrations come from pursuing goals that are not assigned. When a believer aligns with purpose, favor supports that assignment automatically. Resources, opportunities, and visibility respond to purpose because God is committed to funding what He initiated. Ultimately, struggle is not always a sign of resistance from the enemy. Often, it is evidence of misalignment. When alignment is restored, struggle reduces naturally. Favor is not chased, it is attracted. It flows toward those who are positioned correctly, thinking correctly, living correctly, and obeying correctly. Alignment becomes a silent magnet that draws divine assistance, human support, and supernatural speed into a person's life, shifting them from exhaustion into ease, from resistance into acceptance, and from delay into visible advantage under divine order and authority. Divine acceleration is the mysterious operation of God, where time is compressed and results appear at a speed that defies natural processes. It is not haste and it is not luck. It is the intervention of grace responding to obedience. In divine acceleration, years of waiting are summarized into moments of manifestation. Not because processes were ignored, but because alignment allowed God to bypass delays. Obedience becomes the spiritual key that unlocks this realm because God entrusts speed only to those whose hearts are submitted to His instructions. When obedience is present, acceleration is safe, controlled, and purposeful. God values obedience because it proves trust. When a believer obeys, especially in areas that require sacrifice or humility, they are declaring confidence in God's wisdom above their own logic. This posture attracts acceleration because God is able to move freely without resistance. Disobedience introduces friction, and friction slows movement. Even when God desires to move quickly, disobedience forces Him to slow down to preserve the individual. This is why some prayers seem delayed, not because God is unwilling, but because obedience has not created the spiritual conditions required for speed. Divine acceleration often follows simple instructions. Naaman was asked to dip, Peter was asked to cast the net again, Abraham was asked to leave familiar territory. None of these instructions appeared dramatic, yet obedience to them triggered sudden breakthroughs. Acceleration does not always come through complex spiritual activity. It often comes through immediate, unquestioning obedience to a clear instruction. The power is not in the complexity of the instruction, but in the authority behind it. When obedience is delayed, acceleration is delayed. When obedience is instant, acceleration becomes inevitable. Obedience also aligns a believer with divine timing. God operates within time, but He is not limited by it. When a person obeys, they synchronize with God's schedule. Many delays in life are the result of operating on a personal timeline rather than a divine one. Obedience corrects this misalignment. When a believer obeys, even when it feels inconvenient or illogical, they step into God's timing, where seasons overlap and outcomes appear earlier than expected. This is how acceleration happens without confusion or regret. There is also a dimension of preparation embedded within obedience. God does not accelerate an unprepared vessel because speed magnifies both strength and weakness. Obedience prepares the inner man, shaping character, perception, and discernment. As obedience matures a believer, God can trust them with faster results. Many people desire quick success, but God prioritizes sustainable success. Obedience ensures that when acceleration comes, it does not lead to collapse. What appears like delay is often preparation disguised as process. Divine acceleration compresses learning, exposure, and access. A person who walks in obedience begins to learn faster, see clearer, and understand deeper. They avoid unnecessary mistakes because obedience positions them under divine guidance. This guidance saves time by preventing detours. Acceleration is not always about moving faster. Sometimes it is about avoiding wrong paths altogether. Obedience sharpens discernment. enabling a believer to make decisions that save years of correction and recovery. Obedience also activates divine backing. When God backs an individual, resistance loses strength. Doors open with minimal effort because divine authority goes ahead to clear the path. This backing is not earned, it is released in response to alignment. Obedience signals to heaven that a believer is safe to support. Without obedience, divine backing is limited, not because God is withholding, but because support without submission would produce disorder. Acceleration requires backing, and backing follows obedience. Another aspect of divine acceleration is restoration. Obedience positions a believer to recover lost time. God is able to restore years that were consumed by error, delay, or opposition. This restoration does not always mean reliving the past. It often means receiving in one season what should have come over many. Obedience authorizes God to intervene in time itself, rearranging outcomes to reflect His original intention. This is how people suddenly catch up, surpass peers, and step into opportunities that seem beyond their timeline. Obedience also keeps acceleration within purpose. Speed without purpose leads to exhaustion and confusion. Divine acceleration is directional. It moves a believer toward destiny, not just activity. Obedience keeps the believer within divine assignment, ensuring that accelerated progress is meaningful. Many people move fast but arrive nowhere because their speed is self-generated. Divine acceleration carries clarity, focus, and fulfillment because it is guided by God's intention. In seasons of acceleration, obedience becomes even more critical. As results increase, instructions often become more precise. God may demand adjustments in habits, relationships, and priorities. Continued obedience sustains acceleration. When obedience declines, acceleration slows. This is why some people experience sudden breakthroughs that later stagnate. The initial obedience opened the door, but sustained obedience was required to keep the door open. Divine acceleration is not a one-time event, it is a flow that responds to ongoing submission. Obedience also attracts divine trust. God entrusts resources, influence, and visibility to those who obey consistently. Trust accelerates promotion. When God trusts a believer, he no longer needs to supervise every step closely, allowing greater autonomy and speed. This trust is built over time through small acts of obedience. What appears insignificant becomes the foundation for massive acceleration. God watches how a person handles instructions in private before accelerating them in public. Divine acceleration does not eliminate process, it refines it. Processes become efficient, focused, and purposeful. Obedience removes waste from the journey. Instead of learning through repeated failure, a believer learns through instruction and correction. This saves time and energy. Acceleration feels effortless. Not because effort is absent, but because effort is correctly directed. Obedience ensures that energy is invested where it yields maximum return. Ultimately, divine acceleration is a reward of alignment, not ambition. It cannot be forced through desire or impatience. It responds to a heart that is yielded, attentive, and responsive to God's voice. Obedience tunes the spirit to hear accurately and respond quickly. When a believer becomes obedient, heaven begins to move at a different speed on their behalf. Delays lose their authority, opportunities align simultaneously, and results manifest with unusual speed. Because obedience has given God permission to move swiftly, wisely, and powerfully within the boundaries of destiny and divine purpose. Persistent midnight prayers represent a level of spiritual engagement that goes beyond convenience and emotion, touching the realm of spiritual laws and long-term results. Midnight prayer is not a ritual. It is a deliberate posture of authority that communicates seriousness, focus, and endurance. When a believer returns again and again to the place of prayer at such an hour, it sends a clear message to the spirit realm that destiny is not negotiable. Persistence is what turns prayer from a moment into a force. Many doors remain closed, not because they cannot be opened, but because the pressure applied has not been sustained long enough to enforce change. Midnight prayers are powerful because they engage depth, not noise. At that hour, prayer becomes more intentional and spiritually intelligent. The mind is quieter, the atmosphere is still, and the heart is more aware of divine signals. Persistence at midnight sharpens spiritual sensitivity, allowing the believer to pray with accuracy rather than repetition. This accuracy is critical because spiritual doors do not respond to volume but to authority. Authority is built over time through consistency, obedience, and alignment, and persistent midnight prayer develops all three simultaneously. Irreversible doors are not casual opportunities, they are destiny gateways. Once opened, they change direction permanently. Such doors often require sustained spiritual pressure because they are guarded by strong resistance. These doors may represent long-awaited breakthroughs, divine connections, territorial access, or generational shifts. Midnight prayers apply pressure where resistance is strongest. Persistence weakens opposition gradually until a point of collapse is reached. When the door finally opens, it opens fully, not partially, because the foundation of the breakthrough has been secured in the Spirit. Supernatural helpers are often released through persistent prayer. God answers prayers through people, systems, and divine orchestration. Midnight prayer aligns a believer with the network of help assigned to their destiny. Persistence keeps the believer positioned until the right helpers are activated. Many helpers are delayed not by unwillingness, but by misalignment or poor timing. Midnight prayer corrects timing and alignment, drawing helpers into the correct spiritual and physical position. When helpers appear, they do so with clarity, conviction, and authority to assist. Persistence also deals with internal resistance. Sometimes the greatest opposition to destiny is not external, but internal, hidden in fear, doubt, impatience, or inconsistency. Persistent midnight prayer disciplines the flesh and strengthens the spirit. Over time, the believer becomes spiritually resilient, emotionally stable, and mentally focused. This internal transformation is necessary because irreversible doors require maturity to manage what comes next. God does not only prepare the blessing, He prepares the vessel. Midnight prayer accelerates this preparation because it confronts comfort and demands growth. Another dimension of persistent midnight prayer is spiritual legislation. The believer is not merely requesting outcomes, but enforcing covenant rights. Persistence reinforces legal standing in the spirit realm. Just as courts require follow-through and consistency, spiritual systems respond to sustained petitions backed by covenant. Midnight prayer becomes a courtroom engagement where evidence is presented repeatedly until judgment is enforced. This is why some answers come suddenly. After a long period of prayer, the decision was already settled, but enforcement required persistence. Persistent midnight prayers also dismantle cycles. Many lives are trapped in repeating patterns of near success, delay, loss, or stagnation. These cycles are often maintained by spiritual structures that do not respond to occasional prayer. Persistence applies enough pressure to break these structures. Midnight prayer confronts cycles at their root, not at their surface. Once a cycle is broken, progress becomes consistent. The believer moves forward without being pulled back repeatedly because the underlying cause has been addressed. There is also a dimension of spiritual trust that develops through persistence. God entrusts greater authority to those who do not quit. When a believer persists in prayer without immediate visible results, it demonstrates faith beyond outcome. This level of faith attracts divine confidence. God begins to involve such a believer in deeper matters because they have proven reliability. This trust opens doors that are not advertised opportunities that are not competitive, and access that cannot be explained naturally. Persistent midnight prayer changes spiritual rank. Rank determines access, influence, and effectiveness. Those who engage consistently at midnight grow in spiritual authority, not by title, but by capacity. Their prayers carry weight, their declarations produce results, and their presence shifts atmospheres. Supernatural helpers respond more readily because they recognize spiritual authority. Doors open not out of sympathy, but out of recognition of rank and alignment. Midnight prayer persistence also sustains breakthroughs after they arrive. Many people experience answers but lose them due to lack of spiritual maintenance. Persistent prayer builds spiritual infrastructure that supports what God releases. When favor, acceleration, or opportunity arrives, the believer already has the spiritual capacity to protect it. This prevents regression, sabotage, and unnecessary loss. What comes through midnight prayer tends to remain because it is backed by spiritual discipline. Over time, persistent midnight prayer produces a lifestyle of vigilance. The believer becomes proactive rather than reactive. Instead of responding to crises, they prevent them through consistent spiritual engagement. This vigilance attracts peace, clarity, and stability. Life becomes less chaotic because issues are addressed in the spirit before they manifest physically. This is one of the greatest rewards of persistence, a life that is governed, not threatened, by circumstances. Ultimately, persistent midnight prayers reposition a believer into partnership with God's agenda. They move from asking occasionally to standing consistently. Irreversible doors open because the believer has proven readiness, endurance, and alignment. Supernatural helpers appear because the timing has been enforced and the vessel prepared. Destiny responds because persistence has spoken louder than delay. Midnight prayer becomes not just an activity, but a statement of authority, commitment, and trust in God's ability to bring lasting change. When a believer understands this and commits to it, prayer stops being an emergency tool and becomes a governing system. Life begins to move with intention, favor gains stability, and progress becomes sustainable. This is how midnight prayer transforms from an act into a lifestyle, from a request into an enforcement, and from a moment into a destiny-shaping force. This is why those who persist do not just receive answers. They experience permanent shifts that testify of divine involvement and spiritual authority at work.